Hey, good morning, everybody. May I have your attention? Thank you all for coming. Good morning. My name is Artur Kacprzyk. I am an analyst in the International Security Program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, or PISM. I have the pleasure of welcoming the audience here in Warsaw, as well as viewers watching us online on YouTube, to a panel discussion, Finding a New Balance Between Arms Control and Deterrence. PISM is very happy to organize this public event together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland at the margins of the 19th Annual NATO Conference on Arms Control, Disarmament, and Weapons of Mass Destruction Non-Proliferation. This side event aims to both increase the public awareness of challenges faced by the Alliance in arms control matters and to provide additional food for thought for intergovernmental debates among the allies. And we are very lucky to have 4 distinguished speakers with us to advance these goals. So, starting from my side of the stage, let me introduce Emmanuel Maitre, Research Fellow with Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris. We also have with us Łukasz Kulesa, Director of Proliferation and Nuclear Policy at RUSI, Royal United Services Institute. I should actually say welcome home, Łukasz, because till recently Łukasz was Deputy Head of Research at PISM. We are also very happy to have Tutti Erasto with us, Senior Researcher in the Weapons of Mass Destruction program in Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. And let me also welcome William Alberg, Visiting Fellow at the Henry L. Stimson Center. And I should also say probably welcome home, because in one of his previous positions, William was Director of NATO's Arms Control, Disarmament, and WMD Non-Proliferation Center. Now, before I start questioning our experts and then open the floor for some questions from the audience, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes to provide some background for this discussion that we will be having today, because the balance between arms control and deterrence is changing. NATO's 2022 strategic concept reaffirms the commitment of NATO members to arms control, as well as disarmament and non-proliferation. However, this strategy also notes the erosion of this architecture. Russia has again invaded Ukraine under the cover of nuclear threats and has violated or selectively implemented a number of arms control treaties and commitments throughout the years. China is building up its military potential, including nuclear forces, rapidly and without transparency. And North Korea is also expanding its nuclear arsenal, while Iran has gotten significantly closer to obtaining the bomb as well. It is not surprising then that in this environment, the alliance prioritizes deterrence and defense, as the new strategic concept notes that they should be complemented by arms control efforts. And here, today, we'll discuss how they should complement deterrence and defense. Now, I think it is also worth to note that the balance between deterrence and arms control in NATO policy has been shifting throughout NATO's history. While prevention of war through deterrence has been the primary goal of NATO since its inception, the Allies adopted a dual-track approach after the 1967 Harmel Report. Deterrence was now to be better combined with dialogue in order to try to ease tensions and keep the armaments at the lowest necessary level. This led to NATO becoming a major platform for consultations on arms control among the Allies. And the most famous example of this dual-track approach being put into practice came after 1979, when the Allies decided to deploy US intermediate-range nuclear missiles to Europe to both bolster NATO's security, but also to convince Soviet Union to negotiate limits on such weapons. The road was long and difficult, but eventually led to signature of the INF, or Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, in 1987, and an elimination of the whole class of US and Soviet missiles. Soon after, Cold War ended, several other arms control arrangements were concluded, and various unilateral force reductions took place. Later, in 2010, US and Russia signed another treaty limiting their intercontinental range nuclear forces, the New START Treaty. And at the same time, there were hopes and proposals among NATO members to also discuss reducing remaining non-strategic or short-term range nuclear weapons based in Europe, US nuclear weapons, if Russia reciprocated. But this never happened. Deterrence, in turn, was long sidelined in NATO after the Cold War, as Russia was not seen as a threat. NATO's return to deterrence began in 2014 after Russia's first attack on Ukraine. And alliance, although it has not given up on arms control, it faced a continuously deteriorating situation in that domain. Citing Russian violations, US withdrew from INF and Open Skies Treaty in 2019 and 2020, respectively, and then Russia followed suit. Although in 2021 the US and Russia agreed to prolong the New START treaty till 2026, last year Russia suspended inspections and data sharing under this agreement. Moreover, Russia has been rejecting US offers to discuss nuclear risk reduction and talks on follow-on nuclear arms control architecture after New START expires. Russia basically demands that US first drops its support for Ukraine. In 2023, Russia also rescinded the ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or CTBT, and signaled it might return to nuclear testing. Also in 2023, Russia withdrew from the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, or the CFE Treaty, although it was just a formality, because Russia has suspended the treaty already in 2007. And I could talk long about these and other Russian violations and efforts to dismantle arms control architecture in Europe and beyond, but I don't have the whole day for this. We don't have the whole day for this. So let me now just turn to our panelists and ask them what to do with this situation and other challenges. And I will start with William. William, my question to you is, should NATO build up to build down? Or in other words, should the Allies increase their military capabilities to get some trading space with the Russians and incentivize Russia to negotiate arms control agreements?
Thank you. That's a really great question. And first, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me here. Being here is like a bit of a family reunion, seeing so many friendly faces. It's just so great to be amongst friends, allies, and partners. Of course, I know Irene from ADN is probably having heart palpitations seeing me with a microphone in my hand and being asked to address arms control and history issues. Something that people remember from my days chairing committees. But when I was at NATO, I did have the opportunity, I did have the good fortune to find the NATO archives and really try to study the history and context of arms control, because I think it's really important. At the core of this question, I think, is kind of almost a misunderstanding, a misapplication of the idea of what the dual track decision was and how to get to arms control in any sense of the term. I'll recall, if you haven't read it, Rose Gottemoeller wrote a really great article in the Financial Times on the 5th of September, the title being Ramping Up on Nuclear Weapons is Not Always a Bad Thing. And in that, she's making the argument that we do need to build up in order to provide incentive for Russia and China to come back to the arms control table. And while I think that's right in a sense, we do need to show Russia that we are serious about defending ourselves. I think in there's the kernel of a wrong argument that is being repeated. I'll also recall, since Jeffrey Lewis isn't here, I'll be the Jeffrey Lewis Memorial Lecturer and mention Tom Schelling. Tom Schelling, of course, with Morton Halpern, wrote this great book in 1961 called Strategy and Arms Control. In 1985, on December 1st, he wrote kind of an update. How did the book go? How is arms control being interpreted? And one of the things he kind of went after in that book is the idea that countries seek bargaining chips. Because that's not really what happened. I mean, if you go back to the dual track decision, the Special Consultative Group and what would later become the HLG decided what NATO needed to deter the Soviets. And what they decided was they needed Pershing 2 missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles, Griffins, in order to deter Russia. And the arms control ask was to try to figure out what the balance of missiles was going to be. And the Soviets looked at all of this, and they saw that NATO had a comprehensive technological lead on cruise missiles. At that time, the best Soviet cruise missile was the KH-55, KH-555. So there's actually, that cruise missile is the only Soviet cruise missile included in the agreement at one location in Latvia. But they understood that the direction of travel on cruise missiles was not in their favor. And so they wanted to see some kind of limit on the United States. The United States wasn't building these missiles, and NATO didn't agree to deploy these missiles because they thought this would be a good bargaining chip. What they thought was they needed to deter the Soviets. And I think that's how we need to look at the future of deterrence. The Chinese and the Russians have been engaged in an arms race for years. At least the Russians, since 2002, with the Gulf War and all the oil price spike, they've been reconstituting their forces massively. And we have not been racing. And so there are huge gaps when you look at NATO's capabilities and you look at Russia's capabilities in terms of the close battlefield, the medium battlefield, the theater missile capabilities. There's huge gaps there. And the Russians understand that, and they've been exploiting that. And I think China as well has been racing for quite some time. And so we need to show Russia and China that we're serious about deterring them and defending ourselves. And so I do think there needs to be a NATO buildup, but it should always be focused on what we think we need. And that then will help us to deter them. And then at the same time, I do think it's important to think what arms control would look like in the future. What is it that we think the rules should be? What do we think stability looks like? Are we doing our homework? Are we figuring this out? And not waiting for the future to do this, because again, if you go back to the Cold War, that's not what we did. All the way back in the early 60s, the US started a project between the Arms Control Disarmament Agency and the US Army called Cloud Gap. And these were experiments on what was verifiable and not verifiable in arms control. And that then formed the basis for all the agreements that would come after it, including INF, including START, including CFE. There's a lot of homework to do in terms of what we think arms control can look like in the future. But it shouldn't be based on some idea that we're going to jump back in the past. I hear a lot of people say we should recreate the INF treaty. And yet you look at the battlefield in Ukraine, and you look at the types of missiles that are being used. When you talk about what's a ground-launched cruise missile today, the Russians have proven, and the Ukrainians as well, that you can take any ground-launched missile and you can attach it to an aircraft, you can attach it to a ship. You can take anything that's designed to attack ships and you can replace the optics and use it to attack land targets, air targets, anything. So now the idea that somehow you're going to limit ground-launched ballistic or cruise missiles, if you've ever seen what an arms control inspection looks like, you're going to go to a warehouse and you're going to see a bunch of missiles, and the Russians are going to tell you, all of these are air-launched cruise missiles, trust me. But you can mount it on a truck and you can launch it. So the idea that we're going to go back in time and recreate INF is gone. The Russians using S-300s and S-400s against land targets, KH-22s and 32s against land targets. That era of going back into the past is gone. And the idea somehow that the INF treaty could even be recreated, because as Archer pointed out, there were strategic negotiations, there were anti-ballistic missile negotiations, there were short-range negotiations. We were looking at, this was all part of a larger logic of negotiating from a position where NATO had already built up considerably, and we were looking at managing the future. Now, we really do need to think of what do we need to do ourselves, what kinds of systems do we need, how can we configure our forces correctly? And there may be systems that we want Russia to not have, and that's fine. Again, we need to think of what we think the rules should be, but the idea that any nation is going to invest in a system, spend billions of dollars, build it, test it, deploy it, as a bargaining chip, as something to get rid of. Again, this go back to Schelling's piece. He explicitly says that is not the way to go. You have to do what you think you need to do in order to defend yourself. You need to think what you think the rules should be and really design a system that works for you and then work towards positioning yourselves, getting the allies ready for that. But I would really say we shouldn't be thinking about building up to build down. We should be thinking about building up to defend ourselves first. We should be thinking about what the rules should be. And on that basis, we can move forward. But we're not building bargaining chips for the future. We're building systems to defend the NATO alliance.
Thank you, William, for this. Now, I will ask Titi a question about similar subject, the same subject actually, but from different angle. So my question to you is, are there reasons for the alliance to actually continue to exercise self-restraint in its military posture, or at least parts of it? even though the Russians are not doing this, right? For example, NATO is modernizing its short-term range nuclear weapons, but not expanding this arsenal, while the Russians are continuously adding new types of missiles. They said they deployed nuclear weapons in Belarus. So I wonder what are your thoughts about that?
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me here. So my short answer to the question, which I understood more broadly as military restraint regarding also conventional warfare, but also nuclear. So my short answer is yes, I definitely think that the alliance should continue to exercise restraint because the risk of nuclear escalation is real and it could have devastating consequences, not only in our own region, but in the world more broadly. And of course, many of the red lines that were thought to potentially lead to nuclear escalation in Ukraine have already been crossed. For example, NATO countries are now sending advanced conventional weapons to Ukraine, and Ukraine has hit targets deep inside Russia. And these targets include also key strategic assets like early warning radars and air bases, reportedly as far as the Kola Peninsula in the Arctic. And although the Ukrainian strikes have mostly been limited to drone attacks, Ukraine, as you know, is now trying to convince the Western governments to permit the use of long-range precision strike weapons to extend such attacks and to weaken the Russian ability to wage war in Ukraine. However, the Western governments are obviously hesitant to do this as attacks on Russia's strategic assets with NATO weapons and NATO support would bring Allied involvement in the Ukraine war to a whole new level. Of course, those who argue for the removal of long-range missile limits also argue that the Russian nuclear threats are just a bluff. And indeed, the credibility of Russian nuclear threats has been undermined by the fact that Russia still hasn't used nuclear weapons despite the crossing of previous red lines. For example, Ukraine has used Western weapons in the occupied territories, which Russia claimed was under the Russian nuclear umbrella. However, this doesn't mean that the threat of nuclear weapon use has ceased to exist. And I would argue that this threat is very much still part of the dangerous game of escalation being played in Ukraine. And given Russia's conventional military inferiority compared to NATO, Russia is resorting to nuclear threats to manage escalation and more specifically to keep the alliance more from directly intervening in the war. And of course, these threats haven't been that successful as NATO countries are already very much involved in supporting Ukrainian resistance. While this has arguably prevented Russia from winning the war, it has not led to Russian defeat either, but the war just goes on. The Western escalation management, in the meanwhile, has consisted of cautiously pushing against Russian red lines and of gradually increasing the military support to Ukraine. However, if this support would actually tip the balance so that Russia would face defeat or large-scale attacks against high-value targets within its own territory, we cannot rule out the possibility that this could trigger nuclear weapon use. And of course, we don't want to be deterred by Russia, but I think we can't afford to ignore this possibility. Because even a limited nuclear strike could bring about disastrous consequences to human life and the environment. And of course, we're already seeing the horrors of conventional war in Ukraine, but with nuclear weapon use, it could be much worse. And if nuclear weapon use escalates to a nuclear war, this could mean even global scale disaster, keeping in mind that this could involve the two countries with the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. Like more than 90% of nuclear weapons which means thousands of nuclear weapons. So this nuclear gamble is not just about European security, but it's about the rest of the world as well. So instead of further pushing against Russian red lines in the hopes that this will lead to a Ukrainian victory and that it will not trigger a nuclear war, I think third parties could do a bit more to explore options for reducing risks and for ending hostilities in Ukraine. Of course, I don't have an answer on how to end the war, but peace is usually based on some kind of a compromise. And here it's good to keep in mind that Russia and Ukraine already did discuss the outlines of a potential compromise solution in the spring of 2022. And one of the big unanswered questions is whether the war could have been ended already then if these efforts would have received more support from external powers. Of course, the circumstances have changed a lot since then, but I think this diplomatic experience provides at least something to build on. And as for the nuclear dimension of Western military restraint, I think it's been a wise policy from the Biden administration not to respond to nuclear signaling by Russia in kind. For example, the US hasn't engaged in similar aggressive nuclear rhetoric, nor has it raised its own nuclear alert levels. And even the planned US response to a potential Russian limited nuclear weapon use seems to be conventional rather than nuclear. There also seems to be no new plans for tactical nuclear weapons deployments in Europe, and I don't think this would add anything to European security or deterrence of NATO anyway. So I think this is all pretty logical because Russia, unlike Russia, the United States and NATO have no need to compensate for conventional military weakness with nuclear threats. Instead, they are in a position of overwhelming strength when it comes to conventional military power. And by the way, this applies to the number of all major weapons, conventional weapon systems, military spending, and active military personnel, even if one counts out the United States and Canada. Yet nuclear signaling by the United States and NATO has also increased in the context of the war in Ukraine. For example, US strategic bombers frequently fly over European territory, also quite close to the Russian border, and the yearly Steadfast Noon exercise has been given much more visibility than before. However, I think this nuclear signaling is mainly aimed at assuring NATO allies than contributing to deterrence to Russia, because I think already the Russian invasion of Ukraine can be seen as demonstrating the degree to which Russia is already deterred by the alliance and also the prospect of its enlargement. Although the Russian threat perceptions are clearly exaggerated and often dismissed as an excuse, I think it's necessary to try to understand them to realistically assess the threat posed by Russia. The good thing about Russian conventional military weakness, in my view, is that it's very unlikely that Russia would attack any NATO country. It simply doesn't have the means to do that, and even the much discussed idea of a Russian fait accompli in the Baltic has been made much less likely by NATO's Nordic enlargement. The bad thing is that the conventional military weakness of Russia translates into excessive reliance on nuclear threats, which also potentially can lower the threshold of nuclear weapon use. So, thank you.
Tutti, thank you for your comments. Now I will turn to Łukasz. Łukasz, my question to you is it even advisable for NATO allies to try to talk to Russia about arms control at the time when Russia clearly doesn't want to talk about some arms control, is waging war against Ukraine, and is threatening us? So wouldn't trying to talk with Russia in that environment send a signal of weakness? But if we should talk, then please, in this environment, or try to talk with Russia. Please give some examples what we should talk with them about.
Thank you very much, and it's also a great pleasure to be here among friends. And I would argue that actually going back to the title of the session, that arms control has always been, in a sense, restraint or conditions on deterrence requirements within the alliance. And I think you provided this historical short trip in which it's the deterrence and defense requirements that were the starting point, and even in the golden era of arms control, when the US and Russia were negotiating major reductions. These reductions always started with the US assessment of how much of warheads, how much of the delivery systems is needed for credible deterrence. So the relationship has, I think, always been deterrence first and arms control second. Is it advisable to talk to Russia about arms control? Right now, no. But we need to be prepared or look into the potential future scenarios in which such discussions and such dialogue may be conceivable. Why not now? I think effective arms control basically is possible within a certain space. Space between acute confrontation and purely cooperative security relationship. You go below that and arms control is not really needed. You use different tools to pursue cooperation rather than competition. You go above it and then there is very little incentive to actually establish the guardrails and establish rules of the road for competition to mutual restraint, because both sides arguably wants to prevail in a confrontation. So that very much limits also at the conceptual stage or the conceptual level the range of arms control possibilities right now. And this is very much the current situation between Russia and NATO. As I was pointed out, Russia is in the process of trying to dismantle and destroy European security system. I would also say part of the global security and nuclear order. And the divergence of interests and a divergence of values between us and the Russians is quite clear. I would also add at the very practical level the brutality and illegality of Russian aggression, crimes against peace, war crimes that are being committed, very much limits or puts a big question mark on some of the personal interactions that would be needed to actually negotiate arms control agreements. With President Putin, with most of the Russian leadership, there would be a political and indeed maybe even moral price to be paid for such an engagement. To move forward, a premature engagement on arms control might actually be seen as indirectly legitimizing the regime and basically putting a fire break between what happens in Ukraine and other parts of the relationship. Of course, we have also the recent experience of Russian non-compliance, selective compliance, withdrawal from arms trade instruments. So there is a legitimate question whether there is an even minimal level of trust and confidence in engaging on arms control with Russia. We also have the Russian manipulation of risk and basically the subversion of the idea that in a crisis you should be worried about inadvertent or accidental escalation, whereas Russia is eager to play within this zone in order to shape the decision-making of Ukraine, shape the decision-making of allies, and I think Titi also discuss it quite a lot. And then, I mean, Russians, in a sense, are also very much explicitly rejecting arms control discussions. I think even this week we had the latest announcement from President Putin, but also Ms. Zaharova, that it is the overall US hostile policy or Western hostile policy towards Russia that would need to be changed in order to even discuss arms control. And doing it before would be counterproductive or illogical for Russia. So we have a partner that is unwilling and quite unappealing in terms of engaging with arms control. So in the current phase of confrontation, ongoing Russian aggression, really difficult to see the prospects for arms control going beyond some of the very basic risk reduction measures, military-to-military contacts, which are already in place, and from time to time they are happening. So if we have new arms control or semi-arms control proposals, especially by Russia, new iteration of the idea of moratorium for intermediate range missiles, I think it would be seen mostly as an instrument by the Russians, as an instrument of information war or propaganda purposes, something that would be thrown in to test the cohesion of the alliance. The rationale and prospects for arms control may look different in the next phase. If it's, and I'm not sure, I don't venture a guess where this next phase could be. If this next phase is characterized by determination of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, through Ukrainian victory, through other solutions that may include also elements of conventional arms control and confidence building measures, but the phase that is still a phase of increased confrontation or confrontation between Russia and NATO. So a situation in which, in short, Russia would need to rediscover its interest in stability, or discover its interest in stability in reducing the risks of a nuclear or conventional confrontation. What could affect the Russian calculus? Changing the balance of power between Russia and Ukraine plus NATO, putting the additional capabilities that would basically put into a question mark the credibility of Russian nuclear and conventional deterrence posture, its intimidation practices, exchange Russian assessments of its vulnerabilities that again would be connected with their assessment of US and NATO capabilities. Perhaps domestic developments, perhaps the question about sustainability of a high level of defense spending. We just had news about yet another increase of Russian defense budget, but these levels might at a certain point be too much, and the issue of arms race costs may be brought up as a matter that could affect the Russian position. Only such a change with the Russian position would create the preconditions, at least for me, for engaging with Russia on arms control. But then there would be enough of the convergence to have discussions about mitigating fears of surprise attack, reduced risks of advantage escalation, and so on. But even then, it would be a gradual process. There would be still a very high level of mistrust on our side. So I don't see the possibility to just unpause and go back to some of the discussions which we had before 2022 on INF issues, on mutual transparency with regards to missile defense, things like this. The agenda would need to look different. Initial Russian positions would most likely be very maximalistic, including some well-known arguments such as inclusion of Russian or French or UK nuclear forces into arms control negotiations. So we probably need to start slow. What could be the topics of the discussion? I would say, and again mirroring something that I think William said, starting with homework. Starting with the homework, not with the particular weapon system, but with the whole Russian posture and identifying the elements that we consider as particularly destabilizing, elements that we would want to see addressed through arms control measures, so that we would have a topic of conversation or an agenda of conversation with the Russians that would be our rather than their agenda. Definitely, still the Russian strategic nuclear forces, including the exotic system, preventing major qualitative or quantitative advancement of these forces. Here, I think we'll discuss later the issue of the follow-up to the New START. Non-strategic nuclear weapons, yes, very much, but the overall number of warheads may actually matter less than the composition of the Russian forces, and especially that part of the Russian arsenal that would be able to have a prompt and more effective ways to attack NATO on a short notice. Developments in missile defense, that's something that the Russians would most likely thrown in, but we should be also aware about developments in Russian own missile defense system that might have an impact on the strategic forces of our three NATO nuclear weapon states. Development of anti-satellite and space systems that seems to be progressing on the other side. So that's kind of immediate agenda. Something that I would also throw in, the possibility of reactivation of a large-scale chemical Russian program. Are we ready to face that challenge? What instruments could be used through OPCW and other instruments to address this? Resumption of nuclear testing or preparations of resumption of nuclear testing. How can we dissuade or react to such a Russian development? And then the transfer of WMD-related equipment materials to DPRK and Iran, which seems to me an increasingly acute possibility. And the very last point, if we just limit our discussions to NATO-Russia framework, I think we are losing a lot. We need to move this conversation beyond NATO-Russia. And if we are looking at developing or strengthening rules of behavior in areas such as cyberspace, responsible use of AI, or rules of behavior in space, then we would need to have a larger coalition of countries that could put pressure on Russia and perhaps other actors and establishing the rules of behavior to which Russia would need to react or would need to somehow formulate its position on, which would be broader than just the Western rules, if you like to put it that way. That may be also a pretty effective way to move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Łukasz. Moving to Emmanuel. From NATO perspective, is there still a role to be played by arms control and non-proliferation in stopping or slowing the spread of missile technologies and capabilities, not just in Europe, but around the world? Because if you just turn on the news, you see how many things are happening also in missile domain, right? In recent days, second massive Iranian strike on Israel. Houthis still striking or trying to strike ships in international waters. Russia, of course, every day striking Ukraine with missiles. But then again, there's also a growing demand for missile capabilities among NATO members and NATO partners, right? We talked about Ukraine and their own capabilities and the issue of limits on Western use on Western missiles provided to Ukraine, but also NATO members. I mean, the US is to station intermediate range conventional missiles in Germany from 2026, and a group of European countries, including yours and mine, signed a letter of intent to also develop intermediate range conventional forces. So I would welcome your thoughts on missiles.
Thank you very much, and thanks also for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here. I think it's quite interesting indeed to finish this this first round maybe of thinking with focusing really on the topic of missile, because it's, as you said, quite specific when we look at the threat, quite specific when we look at the instruments we have had in the past, we still have today, and that we may consider in the future to control that threat. So, of course, as you said, I mean, it's really obvious that missile developments pose a direct threat for NATO countries. You mentioned a few recent events, but there are maybe four types of elements that are really clearly threatening our security. The rise of the number of countries that have missile capacities, including long range, the massive use of missiles, you said it, in Europe, but also in its margin. The fact that we have proliferation networks of missile technologies which are active, but probably in the direction that was not expected when we created the whole concept of non-proliferation, DPRK or Iran delivering missile technologies to Russia is, of course, a key element. And as you said, also the fact that non-state actors remain the recipients, but also the end users of various range of missiles. So there is a clear and direct threat for NATO countries, which means that there is a potential interest in controlling or trying to regulate that threat. And here we have still some instruments which are, I would say, adding up to create some types of regulations. Of course, some of them being challenged, and we can really put them in different boxes because they are very different in nature, in how they try to approach the threat. The first element is arms control, and I think here William has been speaking about it very beautifully about the INF, the New START Treaty, which were key elements that were regulating some categories of missiles, but of course facing the problems we know. If we focus on non-proliferation and export control, MTCR has been a key instrument to try to create a norm and curb the proliferation of technologies and missile equipments. Looking a little bit on the non-proliferation, but extending, we have the Hague Code of Conduct against the proliferation of ballistic missile, which was adopted in 2002, and it's quite interesting to see that this Code of Conduct had really two objectives, and still has two objectives. The first one, to try to really make universal the norm that there should be an effort not to proliferate these kind of technologies of missiles that can deliver WMDs, and of course a CBM aspect with the idea that countries that have WMD-able missiles should provide some elements of transparency about what types of possibly systems they have, but especially about the launches they make when they make missile tests to avoid any possible misinterpretation. And finally, maybe a big important element of regulation has been dealt with at the UN with UN security resolutions for non-state actors 1540, and for different targeted programs, DPRK, Iran, Yemen, specific UN resolutions that have been attempting to limit those programs, or at least prohibiting those countries from developing some kinds of technologies. Now, if we try to assess where those different types of regulations are today, we see that there are obviously some issues. The main one, I would say, for all the export control, UN prohibitions and proliferation more largely, is the fact that the number of countries that have the capacity to produce domestically their own systems has been growing, and therefore it's more and more difficult to try through a denial of transfer to try to prevent those countries from developing increasingly sophisticated technologies and then to transfer it to whoever wants to sell them. So that's, of course, a major issue that has been plaguing the MTCR and the UN security resolutions. The second one is the lack of implementation, which has been observed on a number of instruments, MTCR being concerned, but of course the UN security resolutions, and we saw it beautifully also this summer with the fact that Russia was ready to violate the prohibition on importing ballistic missile systems from North Korea. Third, I think it's quite clear that we have a number of countries which are refusing the logic of transparency, the idea that transparency can limit the instability of some of these systems, and the problem is that this concerns some countries which are extremely active in exports and in fielding some systems, in particular dual-use systems, which may create some ambiguity on the nature of weapons. So all the instruments, bilateral CBMs, but also Hague Code of Conduct, for instance, there is a limitation because some countries do not want to show this level of transparency. And finally, I think you mentioned it also in introduction, there is a challenge which is created by the fact that there is a demand by more and more countries, allies, partners, to actually acquire some conventional systems which are not built and designed to carry WMDs, but of course which may have the same characteristic, technically speaking, in terms of range, in terms of payload. So this creates an issue, as I will maybe elaborate a little bit. So where does it leave us, and what can we, I mean, what can be the role for this instrument going forward if we place ourselves in a NATO perspective? I think regarding the prohibition and the role of arms control, the treaties, William mentioned INF, I think this has been addressed, and of course there is little we can expect really in the short term from that kind of agreement. If we look to non-proliferation and export control, I think there are two elements we can recognize today. The first one is that there is still an interest in NATO countries, and by interest I mean it is in our interest to restrict access to WMD-able systems. I think this is still the case. And second, I think there is still also an interest in limiting the spread of some technologies which make missiles especially performant regarding, for instance, guidance system, penetration aid, some propellant technologies, and so on. The idea here being that we can maybe still slow down the sophistication of missiles. We cannot prevent it in the long run. We cannot, there are many things we cannot do, but we can still be able to slow down the access of some actors to some types of technologies. So there's still an interest in controlling the spread of some technologies. That being said, we need to recognize that it's difficult to stick to the formal definition of what was a WMD-able system. We've seen it clearly with the example of drones, the categories of the MTCR, 300 kilometers, 500 kilograms for the payload do not seem pertinent anymore regarding the technological developments. And second, we also need to recognize that it's going to be increasingly difficult, and maybe difficult is not even the word. The word would be most probably irrelevant to restrict systems to partners that are faced with these systems that their opponents are freely developing, exporting, transferring between each other, and so on. So there's clearly, on conventional systems, an issue about the actual entrance and relevance in trying to apply the logics we've been, and the kind of formal regulations we've been applying for many years. So here maybe an idea would be to focus and maybe look a bit more to I mean, the purpose remains to try to restrict WMD-able systems, and that's probably the priority, and therefore looking at whether the recipient of technologies is in good standing of its non-proliferation obligations regarding, of course, NPT and so on, may be a criteria which might be more efficient than the technical criteria that we have been applying in the past. Finally, regarding transparency, I think it's quite interesting to see that it's still considered as pertinent by in many parts of the world, and as something that can help address some possible elements of instability. I think it was quite noticeable to see that when China did its latest ICBM test a couple of days ago, it notified bilaterally to a number of countries that it was going to do this test. I understand that there is a push in the US, especially to try to make it official with China and develop a bilateral mechanism of notification, and I think this is really a positive element that we should really support, and of course keep supporting the multilateral instrument that is the Hague Code of Conduct. And maybe another element where it would be interesting to push for more transparency is in the attempt to better distinguish the conventional and the nuclear systems for the countries that are fielding dual-use systems. Of course, at this stage, we know that some countries are not interested in, some of the main countries that have those systems are not interested in transparency, but we may ourselves also be confronted in the future with the acquisition of potentially some of these systems, and so it might be interesting to think ahead also about what can be done to try to combine, I would say, efficiency and operationality on the ground, but also limit the main risk of instability by providing elements to distinguish between systems.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Now, before we go to the Q&A with the audience, and I encourage the audience to think about questions to be asked soon, I'd like to make one more shorter round of exchange with you, because first of all, you put many things on the table. Second of all, there have been some differences in the panel. So I will give you the challenges to respond in 3 minutes, and you can either or respond to some of the things which has been said by others, or take on 2 other issues which I am going to throw in. One is New START. So I think the panel agreed that there are no good perspectives for replacing New START timely in 2026, that it's likely going to just go away without anything else in its place. So what's the implication of that for NATO? And if there was to be a replacement, what should it cover? Should it be just another New START or something else? And the other one, I mentioned Iran at the beginning. What would be the implications for NATO of Iran getting the nuclear bomb? So we will start again with William and go to this side of the scene.
Oh, easy questions, right? Yeah. What should New START cover? I mean, one question that has come up again and again is, what would arms control with China look like? What do we want to limit from them? What would the systems involved be? What would the inspection regime look like? I haven't seen anything in public that shows that anyone's really thought about that. I mean, they think about it, but there's no pen to paper. There's no solution there. So I'd love to see what that looks like. What does trilateral arms control look like? And by the way, how would you even do trilateral arms control when China's most direct competitor is India? I was really interested. Medusa, a great news outlet that looks at Russia, actually listed some of the topics that Sergei Karaganov had been assigned to look at in the updated Russian nuclear doctrine. And one of them, what was the deterrence relationship between Russia, China, India, and Pakistan, and how to manage that. I would love to see more work on that. So you know what I mean? In terms of what strategic arms control will look like in the future, you know, even some of my great colleagues in the United States who I talk to, they're like, well, we're doing Russia and China, but don't make me think about India. And you just think, I was just in New Delhi and I was asking them, what does minimum credible deterrence look like considering China's going up in numbers and types of system, et cetera? And they said, well, it's a very flexible concept, isn't it? So India's going to build up. Pakistan's going to build up. What does the future of arms control look like in terms of controlling nuclear weapons? Should there be a P5 or P8 or P9? You know, do we go beyond the NPT context in order to look at arms control? These are the really hard questions that I have not seen really good answers to, and I think needs to be researched much more. So there's a lot of homework to be done, and I would love to see that. On implications for NATO of no New START, I don't really think there's a big deal there for NATO itself as an organization. This is the lack of constraint on Russian nuclear weapons is worrisome, but them having more strategic systems isn't going to fundamentally change the threat to the NATO alliance. And as long as the United States continues to deter Russia, I don't think that's the biggest. You can worry about it in the abstract, you can worry about it in terms of it's a bad development, but the underlying problem of Russia building up its nuclear arsenal, of China building up its nuclear arsenal, fundamentally, as long as the alliance sticks together with the US, the UK, and France as the nuclear guarantors of NATO security, doesn't matter as much. Iran building the bomb is a different matter. We are in an era where UN Security Council sanctions are probably never going to happen again because Russia defending Iran. Russia now owes Iran directly in terms of supporting its war effort. Russia now owes North Korea directly. I recall a couple of years ago, Gerasimov gave a speech in Moscow where he listed all the arms control treaties that Russia should pull out of. And he said, NPT and the IAEA, no, because we can do more damage by staying inside and protecting our friends than we can on the outside if they're just deciding things. So I think we are entering into a new era where Iran may feel emboldened and protected. We've already seen a direct missile attack against a state with nuclear weapons. Truly extraordinary period. And so I think if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons with Russia acting as a shield, then that would have implications for NATO's security. It would certainly have implications for NATO's partners in the region. And NATO would have to, I think, work very closely with the countries in the Middle East and the Istanbul Cooperation to listen to them and to work together.
Thank you, William. Tutti?
Yeah, about the expiration of the New START treaty, I mean, it could lead to unlimited nuclear buildup again between the US and Russia, and I don't think that's a good thing for NATO. I mean, although immediately things might not change, but there's also a lack of transparency, which could then feed worst-case threat perceptions and crisis instability. And as for the idea that more buildup of nuclear weapons could pave the way for arms control in the future, I don't think that's gonna, I mean, if as a result the US would build up its weapons, I don't think that necessarily adds any useful bargaining chips with Russia and China, because they are already more concerned about non-nuclear systems with strategic effects like missile defense and precision strike weapons and their combined effect on the counterforce capabilities of the United States. And I think if these things would in some future negotiations be put on the table, then, I mean, those could be more useful bargaining chips, and that relates to how future nuclear arms, how future arms control or strategic arms control would look like. I think it can't just focus on nuclear weapons, so I think missile defense needs to be there, and that's not really a new thing. I mean, the ABM treaty was the basis for nuclear arms control for like 30 years, for a long time. And maybe, although there can't be an INF treaty like in the form it existed before, maybe there should be a new INF treaty as well that would cover not just land-based systems, but also other systems, because these precision strike, intermediate range missiles of today, they also have nuclear counterforce potential, so they might impact the willingness of countries to reduce their nuclear arsenals.
Thank you, Łukasz.
Just relating to what Tutti put on the table right now, I think there's also, and we can go back also to the requirements for deterrence and defense, and some of the systems that you described. Of course, they carry certain risks of misinterpretation or being used to also target parts of the Russian nuclear infrastructure. But at the same time, they would have a crucial role in our deterrence and defense planning for reacting and defeating any Russian conventional incursion. Because they would be used to attack targets which would be connected with the continuation of such an assault, and also be used to limit damage from a potential Russian also deep strike into our territory. So I think there is a certain balance there to be put. Their escalatory or destabilizing value versus the value as elements of strengthening our deterrence potential. With regards to post-New START, just to remind everyone that in the rounds of 1.5 rounds of strategic stability dialogue, the positions of the United States and Russia were quite apart. The US agenda was basically New START plus all the warheads, whereas the Russian position was that we would need to take into account a much broader range of system, the Ryabkov strategic equation approach. So if we were to come back to this kind of the discussions, these differences of the approaches would not disappear, and it's unlikely to be bridged. It was very difficult to see it bridged before February 22. It's even more difficult to see it being bridged after 2024. It would be, I think, important not to treat 26 as a period which is, or as a day that is so important that it would need to force, especially the United States, to put proposals on the table. I think it would be, something like this would be exploited by the Russians to try to use or utilize this fear of a world without arms control treaties to push for its own position. Whereas what happens afterwards, I mean, the US thinking is increasingly directed or increasingly influenced by the Chinese buildup. And we've heard it in some of the speeches of the major officials from the administration, that this might actually require the United States to also go up in terms of number and potentially capabilities, which in a sense is a bad news for arms control. It's unlikely to have the next generation bilateral, trilateral X members treaty, but it might be good news for the allies in terms of basically somehow confirming the U.S. resolve and confirming confirming the U.S. resolve and confirming the U.S. Capabilities to deal with simultaneous or near simultaneous challenges in both theaters.
Thank you, Emmanuel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, maybe building on what was said regarding the immediate effect for the alliance of the extinction of the New START treaty, I think we cannot expect indeed very massive developments or something that would change the balance immediately. I think it was Tutti who said that, of course, it would be quite unrealistic to imagine that Russia would be able to increase massively because of its financial constraints, industrial constraints and everything. We can not imagine really going very fast above the ceiling. That being said, I would maybe add a little nuance here. Potentially not immediately, but in a couple of years, there might be an incentive in Russia to go above the ceiling, to push on some of the three categories of weapons. And then I was wondering if it would create a pressure maybe in the US to answer a little bit symmetrically, not really for strategic concerns, but more for political issues. We know that it can be difficult sometimes politically to assume that there is no parity. And of course, this notion of really equal parity between different categories of strategic weapons is probably a bit outdated, but it might still have some political traction in Congress. And so I was maybe thinking that it could lead to some investment that would be more politically motivated than really have a strategic consideration, and that it might create possibly some eviction effect from programs which would make more sense for the security of the alliance than just keeping up with the Russians in terms of strategic numbers. So that was just maybe a medium-term consequence, and maybe also something more technical and more medium-term as well. I think New START treaty was very important for creating working habits at the technical level between people implementing arms control on a day-to-day basis, sending notifications, working in the National Nuclear Risk Reduction Center and everything. There is expertise, there was interpersonal relationship to some extent about implementation. Of course, it's going to be more difficult to rebuild in the future if for a couple of years, many years, this work does not exist. Regarding your question about Iran and proliferation, I think, of course, the destabilization that it would lead to is pretty obvious. Regarding the regime itself, I think it should not be underestimated that it would have an impact. Today, we've been building our security on the NPT, on the idea that most countries, a majority of countries of the world, do not seek to become nuclear weapon states. And this decision is based on their own perception of their security, on the power of the norm of the treaty, and on the ability to make sure that there is consequence, there is cost that is paid if a country does not respect that norm. And of course, as William said, in the situation of Iran, we would not be able to impose any costs anymore in terms of multilateral costs. We would still be able to do it at our national EU level, US level, and so on, but at the multilateral level, it would not exist. And I think if there was another NPT withdrawal, it will also weaken the power of the norm, and therefore, without maybe going back into the conversation of it would have a ripple effect and the things that we were speaking about in the 90s, without maybe making it too automatic, I think it would still have an impact on the power of the non-proliferation norm, which, when we say it's the core of our security and so on, I think it's not just a formula. It's really something real, and then we would have to probably suffer if this Pandora's box was opened in some way.
Thank you. I'm opening the floor for questions. So I will start maybe with gentlemen over here in the second row up front. Then please state your name and affiliation and be brief. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Rolf Nickel. I'm the former German Commissioner for Arms Control and Disarmament. I have actually, I'm gluttonous, I have 4 questions. The first one is, we have this discussion about new missiles to be stationed, to be deployed in Germany. If I understand and there is a debate in Germany about should we have an arms control proposal associated with it? If I understand the debate correctly here, you would be against it. That is directed particularly to William Olberg. The second question is to Łukasz, but it's about compartmentalization. Because what you were arguing for, you can't have any discussions with the Russians because of all the problems we have. If you look back at the arms control and in early arms control, I mean, we had the Vietnam War, we had Afghanistan, and still we were trying to somehow discuss these issues. So I'm not sure whether this should be done that way. The third one is the main problem is substrategic nuclear weapons with Russia. Now, I mean, the imbalance is absolutely great. Yeah, I mean, there's no question about this. What can we do about this? Because this is something we need to do something, maybe not immediately, but in a very short time. And the fourth question is, if the issue is America turning to China, etc., and I think of course that's to a certain extent true. What does it mean for Europe? Do we have to have a European nuclear deterrent? If so, what should it look like? And one fifth point about Iran. Let's not worry too much about that. The Israelis will take care of that.
Okay, thanks. Now we'll go to the lady in the middle, in the green outfit, please.
Good morning, everyone. Anna Dyner, Polityka Insight. I will have one question to all of distinguished panelists. What should be the NATO/member states' reaction for announcements of the changing in Russian nuclear strategy? Because Putin announced that probably Russia will decrease the threshold in which they will use nuclear weapons. So what to do with that? And what should be the reaction of NATO when the new doctrine will be published? Thank you very much.
That's already quite a lot, so we will do a second round. If you could please stick to 2 minutes, each one of you. And this time we'll start from Emmanuel and go towards William.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'm going to speak about the last question about the new doctrine. So first of all, of course, we've not seen the final document, so we still have to be a little bit careful. I think something I would be cautious about is overreaction or over criticism of what is being written on paper, which is quite different from some of the declarations that have been made in the past 2 years. I think it's quite interesting to actually look at the elements very very carefully and to see that in some, I mean, from what we can see, it looks more responsible than many of the declarations that have been made by different people in the Kremlin over the past 2 years. And so I think I would try to, it seems to me that there is an interest in trying to highlight the fact that there's been the rhetoric which we have criticized, that we need to criticize, that we need to call out Russia for every time there are nuclear threats or really irresponsible rhetoric. But if we can really emphasize the fact that, and try, as has been done, I think, to convince other states, India, China, and everything, to call out Russia and to make sure that it sticks to its official doctrine, that when it says that it's a responsible nuclear country, that it actually follow that. I think that that could be also an efficient way to go.
Yeah, on the question of compartmentalization, I mean, for me, the Cold War experience is one in which strategic arms control really took up at the moment when the Soviet Union was increasingly a status quo power, especially when it came to relationship with the United States, but also the questions of European security. And at that point, the European theater was seen as a crucial one. So you had this convergence of interest in stabilizing the relationship and also preventing the escalation to the nuclear level, connected with the more or less Russian or Soviets' satisfaction with the situation in Europe. Right now, we are not there. The Russians are actively kind of undermining and attacking the European security system. With regards to the division compartmentalization, it was never, I would say, it was never full. You could look at the consequences of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan for SALT treaty and the break that it pulled on arms control. So I would still stick to the idea that you would need to look more holistically at the situation. Reaction to changes in the Russian doctrine, 30 seconds, new Secretary General, that might be a good opportunity for him to use one of the next public engagements to restate the basics of the NATO's approach to deterrence, including especially the nuclear component, the fundamentals on which the NATO approach is built.
Tutti?
Yeah, on the German INF deployments, I think in my view, it would make sense to also try some kind of arms control solutions related to that, because once these systems and other, I mean, not just the systems that are being deployed in Germany, there are also other intermediate missile deployment plans in Europe. Once these systems are deployed, it's very hard to give them up when all the investments have been made. And although it's, I agree, it's not a good time to talk about arms control with Russia, but on the other hand, arms control is based on interest. I mean, you don't lose anything by keeping the door open. Maybe it could pave the way for some kind of a agreement on intermediate range missiles, because I don't think, like I think discussed before, the issue is not so simple. I mean, they are on the one hand adding to deterrence, but they are also increasing or undermining strategic stability, even though these are conventional systems. And if there would be some kind of an agreement, new agreement on intermediate range missiles in Europe, that could also help. That might also help to address the problem of Russian tactical nuclear weapons, because Russia's systems of this range, they are also, dual capable. They can be used to deliver tactical nuclear weapons. So I think Europeans would have an interest in keeping this door open, at least.
Thank you, William.
To Rolf, I do think there should be an arms control ask, but what we've understood is this is not a US-Russia problem anymore. Remember, in 1979, it was a US-Russia problem. It's not a US-Russia problem anymore. It is a much broader problem on how to handle missiles. For the Missile Dialogue Initiative, I wrote an extensive paper with Emmanuel's help on, I think we need to fundamentally rethink how we approach missiles. And if we can't figure out more of a global approach, we're in trouble. You'll recall one of the biggest crises in the INF negotiations was when Reagan agreed with Gorbachev's proposal to handle Europe first and Asia second. And Nakasone, the Prime Minister of Japan, almost broke the US-Japanese alliance over that because he had to remind Reagan that Asia faces an acute threat from Russian missiles as well. So there is no European solution. I don't believe you can salami slice intermediate out. Remember, that was part of strategic, intermediate, and short range. So you have to go much more comprehensive. I do think having an ask is good, but what is the ask? What systems? How do we handle this? Is a much bigger question than it was in 1977 through 1987. Just to briefly say on compartmentalization, I absolutely agree. You're 100% correct. When people say, how do we get back to arms control with Russia and China, the question is, how do we move them from disruption to status quo? Because as long as they're a disruptive power, arms control just doesn't work. When you're status quo, arms control is better. And one way to get to status quo is to have the deterrence capabilities that makes the adversary worried that they're losing more than they're gaining. On tactical nuclear weapons, yeah, so how do we convince Russia that NATO has the capability to deter it and that it doesn't have comparative advantage in that system? Basically, how do we convince Russia that attacking us with tactical nuclear weapons isn't going to win the war for them? And that means better integrated air and missile defenses, more forward to deny them the capabilities to destroy our systems. It also may mean that NATO needs different configurations of nuclear weapons. And here, I would say Artur and I just published a piece on the Stimson website on 10 ways to improve NATO's nuclear deterrent that Europeans can do right now that would help convince Russia that this is not a useful thing for them to contemplate, the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons. I highly recommend reading it, and sorry to Jim Stokes for putting so much work on you, but there is a lot more that needs to be done. In terms of Russian nuclear doctrine, just real quick, I think Putin ran into a little bit of a trap because the 2020 nuclear doctrine was written more for the NPT audience. It wasn't true, it didn't reflect Russian policy, and so when he was making nuclear threats, he realized that his doctrine actually restricted the ability of even Russian sympathizers to understand Russia's nuclear threats. So he needs a doctrine that matches his desire to threaten countries. And if you look at Russian systems and deployments and exercises and threats, we know what their doctrine is. We know they have a very low threshold for nuclear use. We know that they have a doctrine for nuclear demonstration strikes. It was the 2020 doctrine that too many people put too much credibility on that was the problem. I don't care what the doctrine says. I care what systems are being deployed, I care about how they're being exercised, and I care about how leaders use those threats. That tells me much more about the doctrine than some decree that Putin publishes.
Thank you. I'll do one more round of questions. So I will start with lady over there at the back, then lady over here, but please be brief, 30 seconds. Then we'll go to the gentleman over there and the gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. I'm Katrin Chimizu from the German MFA, and I don't have a question, but I do have a comment on this discussion of linking this US announcement of stationing missiles in Germany to an arms control offer. And my comment is, an offer to whom? We have heard Russia very clearly rejecting any engagement in arms control and disarmament. We have heard it at the NPT PrepCom. We have heard it just last week with respect to New START. And the US offer for arms control talks with Russia is on the table, but Russia still rejects any talks with the US side. So that's the first thing. The other thing is an arms control offer or trade for what? I mean, what we are talking about are conventional systems. And if we look on the Russian side and this huge imbalance on nuclear and also nuclear capable substrategic systems, I'm really concerned about thinking a proposal where we give away the little thing we have for this huge imbalance. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very
because
much.
I'm concerned about the security of our population. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lady over here. Can we get the mic over here?
Good morning. I'm Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, I'm the Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Just three brief things. On the issue of arms control with Russia, one of the things that is important, and as you know, the U.S. continues to request and push for Russia to engage with us on arms control and to implement the existing New START treaty, which is in existence. While we know that there are challenges with arms control, one of the things that's very important is that we continue to signal to the Russians the importance of arms control, that we signal to the rest of the world the importance of arms control, and that the U.S., as was just said, is always ready to engage with Russia. And also, if one of the things that's been said is Russia is saying sometimes the disinformation that the U.S. is not ready. So to them, there is a value in others thinking that the U.S. doesn't want to do it. So there is a value to at least recognize and to show to Russia that we are ready and to show to Russia that we're serious about it. And that they do have to implement their international legal obligation of implementing New START. Also, it's important to continue some kind of conversations with them. So we have the P5 discussions that do take place. But you don't want to be in a situation, if you can avoid it, where nothing is happening. Even if you can't have arms control, you still want to have some kind of discussions and transparency. Another question that was raised about, this is definitely an issue that's not just U.S. and Russia. The problem is Russia they don't want to talk to them about the U.S. So the way that we deal with that is we do have consultations with NATO, where we did have the two engagements with Russia before they invaded Ukraine. Both times we came back and spoke with NATO about what happened. So we do engage NATO, and certainly want to know what NATO is thinking in the negotiations that we have with Russia.
And your last point, please.
And my last point is on the China. I know there was raised about what happens if the U.S. moves from NATO to China. That was never the intention. The idea is that we would stay in NATO, and we would also be able to deal with China. Now, of course, everyone's thinking we have an election coming up. I acknowledge that, but I just wanted to make sure that there was an understanding on that. So thanks.
Thank you so much. Gentleman over here in the middle.
Thank you. Robert Schell, Center for Eastern Studies, and before NATO and Polish MFA. Let me ask perhaps the most provocative question in a formal comment, which some people in the room expect from me. Look, I mean, I'll make a confession. When I was a young diplomat, I spent a lot of time on arms control, etc. CSBMs, CFE treaty. That was the beginning of my. And I was like everybody else. I was a great fun. I thought it served the purpose with all the. The problem is, we live in a completely different world. Our colleague from Stockholm. I mean, keeping the door open. The door has been ripped apart, burned on the steppes of Ukraine. The issue is, and here's my question, wouldn't the panel actually agree? I know it's provocative because there's a lot of people in the room who actually professionally devote their time to arms control. Arms control should be seen, any idea, thoughts, only as a form of helping those objectives which are absolutely fundamental, which is indeed security, which is deterrence, and therefore one should approach them from the point of view, if you like, utilitarian. So those objectives that normally, in normal times, we would try to realize as part of any kind of arms control and similar agreements, should be implemented through other means. And if arms control somehow could help, I won't even develop the point, you know what I mean, then frankly, not sufficient amount of time should even be spent on this, because that does send a signal to those, and the key word is we should not be requesting. We should not be requesting, as we know who we're dealing with. So, yes, it's provocative, but I would like still the panel to answer.
Thank you so much. I have to cut you off there. Wojciech?
Thank you very much. Wojciech Lorenz, Polish Institute of International Affairs. I would like to reinforce the opinion of our German colleague. I strongly believe that we have the problem with the status quo, and we need to take the long road to strengthen the deterrence, to have the arms control. Don't you think that between the status quo and strengthening the deterrence, we have some additional room of maneuver by renunciation of NATO-Russia founding act that imposes the limits both in conventional but especially in nuclear domain? Thank you.
Thank you. So we're almost over the time. It's all the chair's fault. Minister, you wanted to make a question, so please, and we'll end with that. Can we get the microphone over here? And please.
Well, I have a very short question, because there is a certain danger which is looming all the time and which is not very often addressed to, and this is the weaponization of the space and the seabed. You know, the loitering munition in the space could be really quite a threat. So is there any sort of chance, as long as there is no country which has preponderance in this area, to have some kind of an agreement on that? Thank you.
Okay, I will take the risk of extending this session by 5 to 10 minutes. So is there any remaining question? I will take one. I see no hands up. So please, a minute and a half for each of you. This time we will start with Tutti, then Łukasz, Emmanuel, and William. So Tutti, go ahead.
There were so many questions on maybe on the issue. If I can go back to the INF missiles. I mean, of course, from a national perspective, there's a huge imbalance when you compare the national capabilities of one NATO country compared to Russia and its huge nuclear arsenal. So that's one perspective, but I mean, when you look at it in the context of the alliance, then it looks a little bit different. And I mean, these, for example, the Tomahawk conventionally armed cruise missiles, they, according to a recent study, are capable of destroying nuclear silos. And I mean, that does affect strategic stability, and I think we should keep that in mind. And okay, we see these. I mean, probably Russia is not interested in arms control, but I think we need to maybe not just focus on statements at the NPT or these public fora. I think maybe if there is an interest in arms control, maybe that could be explored in some other context. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Łukasz.
Thank you. I think Robert's question is not that provocative. It's very much a legitimate question about the uses for arms control. And Michael Kreppen, he suggested that the role of arms control is to take some of the rough edges of deterrence, to deal with some of the challenges that the mutual deterrence relationship poses in terms of avoiding or minimizing the likelihood of accidental or inadvertent escalation, and also keeping the costs of armaments in check. But I would very much agree that this is, in a sense, an addition in the current circumstances of an increased competition, strategic competition, that unfortunately it is an addition or a complementary element to the deterrence relationship. Weaponization of space, here I'm not optimistic. I see, it's logical for some of our opponents to actually look at the opportunities to weaken or challenge our uses of space, which is crucial for NATO in terms of conducting operations. I mean, some of the proposals which Russia and China put on the table, including PAROS and its various modifications, these are very much, at least for me, propaganda exercises. We have another route, which is about the responsible use of space and establishing norms of behavior that would be as universal as possible. And also basically mobilizing the international community to react to any initiatives, developments that would basically deepen the possibility of weaponization of space, putting nuclear assets into space, orbit anti-satellites tests. Here, it's not just about the reaction of NATO. I think it's more about broader reaction. NATO-Russia Funding Act, I mean, if you look at it, it's already, and you try to cross out the elements that are not valid anymore or has been violated by Russia. You have a document that is already 2/3 in red. So in a sense, sticking to the illusion that we have the 1996-1997 situation in which some of the restraint of our side was supposed to bring restraint on the Russian side. For me, it makes less and less sense in 2024. That also includes the elements connected with the constraints about the permanent deployment of conventional forces. It's also, and we should put this thing on the table sooner or later, the issue of the 3 nuclear nodes. It's not about necessarily going directly into new deployment, but it might be about creating a freedom of maneuver for NATO that might be increasingly needed in an enlarged alliance.
Thank you, Łukasz. Emmanuel?
Yeah, very quickly, I think the point on agreeing or not on regulation on conventional systems, conventional missiles that may be deployed in Europe is extremely important. Some of the arms control mechanisms we had were not designed to control conventional missiles. INF controlled them a little bit by accident, but the main focus was nuclear systems. And if we try to apply some regulation systems that were designed for nuclear missiles to conventional systems, we may run into an issue. So of course, it's true that some conventional systems may have a strategic effect. The Chinese, the Russians have been saying it for many years, and it might be true in some situations, but we need to recognize that in most cases, conventional missiles, even longer range, I mean, not only short range, but medium range and intermediate range as well, are warfighting for conventional combat tools, and we cannot expect to have the same, and it would be really completely unbalanced to try to trade them off with nuclear systems. For instance, they don't play the same purpose, they don't have the same goal, and they don't pose the same threat. I think that the panel and the conference has really emphasized the fact that arms control must serve security, and that's very clear, and I think it's very fortunate that we've been able to pass this message, and that it's not just a gesture of goodwill or something we give away. That being said, I think it's also important to recognize that arms control is something that is also expected of nuclear weapon states in non-proliferation forums in particular, and so I think the efforts that have been displayed in the past few years to show that there was an openness, there was a willingness to negotiate, and the problem came from Moscow first and foremost, or also Beijing maybe second, is quite important, and it's pertinent to do it collectively at NATO level also to show that there is goodwill in NATO. And that it's not, NATO is not the blocking factor, especially maybe because it's not always been as clear-cut, but really in the past few years it's been quite obvious, and we know that in non-proliferation forums and PT forums, NATO is targeted as itself as an alliance, so being able to have a narrative and to show really what we think collectively on these issues is quite important.
Thank you, Emmanuel. William?
On the NATO-Russia Founding Act, couldn't agree more with Łukasz. I mean, when you read it, it was written as a waypoint to ACFE ratification. It says specifically, noting that Russia's military doctrine has become more benign and it's withdrawing forces from Eastern Europe. I mean, so many of the entering arguments of the document are just nonsense now. Plus, we had regular consultations with Russia before the NATO-Russia Founding Act. We had the PJC and the NACC. We have the bodies for it, so there's literally no reason to have it. And actually having it, I think, does more damage. Having a document that even if relations were good with Russia, still makes no sense. And to point to that and say that's still binding, it needs to be formally gotten rid of. On Robert's question, absolutely right. I mean, the point of CFE was you did wargaming. And you said, okay, how can we add indicators and warnings of surprise attack and therefore be able to defend ourselves better? people look at arms control and they sometimes say, oh, it's a menu of options you can just give the other side. No, it's about understanding what warfare looks like in the 21st century and being able to both have the ability to prevent the other side from thinking they can launch a surprise attack, as well as having a body where you can address the actual issues and solve them. And right now, as Russia is trying to increase instability, it's trying to increase its threats. We also have to remember, Russia never complied with the CFE flank agreements, ever, on armored combat vehicles. And in the Vienna document, to this day, Russia has never had a mandatory observation of an exercise, which means in the entire west of Russia, they would say they've never had an exercise of more than 13,000 troops, even though their MOD will say they have exercises of 150,000 troops. And yet somehow this was never a problem. We never raised this as a compliance issue. It is crazy. We need to get back to the understanding that arms control supports your military intelligence and your threat assessment, and if it doesn't increase your security, it's dangerous.
Thank you, William. We'll stop on that. Given that we are over time, I won't try to make a summary of this discussion. I will just thank all of you who are watching us online and participants gathered here. And now, please join me in thanking first and foremost our great speakers, but also my colleagues from the Polish MFA and PISM who made this event possible.